stage, but we are learning from our mistakes, and we are trying to conquer the digital divide and let technology empower us and make sure that we can use it for the betterment of the Commission's advocacy work as well. But from my side, maybe just a quick one. We are going to start live streaming the session just for everyone on the platform. So the attendees currently on the platform will not be the only people who will be listening in and joining this discussion. We will be joined online, and we will have a look if there's any comments that come from the online discussion, whether we can integrate that and put this to the panelists as well. So that's just a little bit of house rules and house outlines, basically, to make sure that you know that we are going to be recorded, and we are, as I think, as of now, we are live on YouTube and the Commission's official YouTube channel. So once again, thank you so much to everyone who is joining online, who's joining this platform through Teams as well. This is the first of a series of discussions that is hosted by the South African Human Rights Commission, where we unpack issues relating to women's rights, and particularly during this month of August. Now, this would be the first session, and this session we have titled Unveiling the Gendered Nature of Institutions. Now, hosting a discussion on the nature of gendered institutions during Women's Month is not only timely, but also critically relevant for the South African Human Rights Commission. Women's Month serves as an opportunity to spotlight the achievements, challenges, and rights of women, making it an ideal platform for engaging in dialogues that shed light on the pervasive gender inequalities deeply embedded within societal structures. By convening such a discussion, the Human Rights Commission demonstrates its commitment to upholding human rights and equality, aligning with its mandate to address systemic issues that perpetuate discrimination and marginalization. This initiative not only provides a platform for sharing insights and experiences, but also paves the way for identifying concrete measures that can lead to institutional change and the realization of gender equality. Through this discourse, the Human Rights Commission not only acknowledges the multifaceted dimensions of gendered institutions, but also catalyzes a collective effort to dismantle them, fostering a more inclusive and just society for all genders. Now, as I've indicated, I will be facilitating this session as we venture through a few key areas of this discussion. But this discussion is hosted by Commissioner Philile Ntuli. Now, in introducing Commissioner Philile Ntuli, I would just like to read a short bio. Commissioner Ntuli's life's work focuses on women's relationship with the state. She's particularly interested in exploring how and whether South Africa's project of democratization can disrupt historical gendered hierarchies. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science and English literature, as well as a postgraduate diploma on public policy development from UKZN. She further obtained an honours degree in sociology and gender studies and a master's degree in social sciences, gender studies from the University of Pretoria. Commissioner Ntuli has also attained certification from the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute on the topic of African political economy. In addition, she has received training in media monitoring and public relations. This discussion is therefore hosted by Commissioner Ntuli, and we will be introducing the panelists as we venture into setting the context and the purpose for today. So Commissioner Ntuli, if I can ask you to please, if possible, put on your camera and then perhaps give us the context and the purpose for the discussion of the day, and then we will proceed from there from our side. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Carter. Good evening to everyone. I hope you can see me. It's been a long day. I'm joining from the Free State. I'm very pleased that we are finally able to have this very, very important seminar that has been convened by our Eastern Cape provincial office. It is quite an important topic to grapple with the notion of institutions themselves being gendered. And I do hope to unpack what my interpretation of what we mean when we speak about institutions being gendered. My contribution will focus mainly on women's ascendance to especially positions of executive authority and senior positions within institutions, to grapple with what that means in relation to this notion of the gendered nature of institutions. And in doing so, perhaps I want to just foreground that contribution by noting that the appointment of women into positions as well as institutions that were particularly reserved for men has been lauded as a necessary component of the processes of democratization across the world, not just in South Africa. And it's also widely increased satisfaction with governments, particularly amongst female citizens. What that means is that when female citizens think about governments and their satisfaction of governments, the idea of having large numbers of women into positions that were previously reserved for men is often seen as a positive step forward by governments and by institutions. However, over time, globally as well as in South Africa, there have been uncertainties that have remained regarding whether women's descriptive representation translates into women's political influence and changes in gendered relations. More recently, it's been suggested that women's appointments may have little to no impact on public attitudes and on masculinist cultures towards women. Now, notwithstanding this gap in knowledge about the impact, public attention continues to focus on increasing women's access into, while often overlooking the question of women's participation as gendered beings within institutions. Now, what is the matter? There is a gap between, on the one hand, the presumed powerfulness of the position itself, and the gendered nature of the power that women in fact exercise, which inadvertently alienates women from the women citizens that they are assumed to represent through their access of these senior positions. They are therefore consequently cast as insiders to institutional power structures in manners that may obviate their own vulnerabilities to varying forms of gendered discrimination. This is as a matter of introducing my own contribution to this discussion, and perhaps through yourself, Program Director, I will then unpack what I mean by the gendered nature of institutions, or the institutions themselves having a particular gender. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. That is absolutely valuable for us to set the tone for this discussion and also the direction. There are keywords that you've mentioned here that I would like to follow up on when we've engaged with the panelists as well. And for me, it would be the gap. There's a clear gap in the dichotomy of bringing the vulnerabilities of women and the women that we represent, and the powerfulness and the structured power that the position itself represents together, and to see how one would grapple with that. But before we engage in the full body of the discussion, I would like to introduce our panel members. And after I've introduced our panel members one by one, I will be reverting back to the panel members just for a short feeling of how do they feel about the topic, or their initial thoughts on the topic, very shortly so. as we then venture into the deeper meat of the discussion of the day. So Ms. Zukiswa Nkolomba is a senior public sector leader with roots deeply embedded in strategy, economics, poverty, and public policy. She has 2 master's degrees, a master's from the University of Cape Town and a master's in poverty and development from the University of Sussex in the UK. She also holds an executive leadership training certificate from Harvard University. She's currently doing her PhD at the University of Cape Town, and she has done research work on state building meritocratic states, and professionalizing the state. She is the National Commissioner and the Deputy Chairperson of the Public Service Commission of South Africa, and she is joining us here, Commissioner or DC Nkolomba. Thank you very much for joining us here tonight, and we welcome you to the panel. Perhaps referring to you, Deputy Chairperson Nkolomba, if you can give us your initial thoughts about the topic. You can just unmute yourself, DC. There we go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carter, and thank you so much for the welcoming introduction. So basically for me, I think one thing I want to anchor our discussion upon is the fact that the gendered nature of institutions is foregrounded on a system of patriarchy, a system of sexism, discrimination of women, and misogyny. So I think it's important for us to understand that this is a systemic process of discriminating against women on the basis of their gender and looking at their positionality as the weaker sex of society and as a vulnerable group of society. I know that in the public service, as it stands, women only make up 45% of SMS positions in the public service. They only make up 50% of cabinet, only make up 46% of MPs. So in terms of gender representation, women make up less than 50% of what is supposed to be when it comes to occupancy and representation in the public service and public life in general. Secondly, I think it's important for us to also note that even when women do occupy positions of responsibility and positions of authority, they are often neglected, they are often undermined, they are often ignored by their male counterparts in the boardroom. And this is what we call the cultures of toxic masculinity, which undermine the role and contribution of women in the workplace. So when we speak of gendered institutions, we speak about not just representation, but the cultures that devalue the contribution of women, femininity, and their contribution in general towards societal building and social transformation. And that's basically my contribution for today in today's discussion, Dr. Carter.
Thank you, Deputy Chair, for that very valuable insight into the statistics currently as it is in women's representation in the public service, something we will definitely have to delve deeper into. The next panel member I would like to welcome is Ms. Shirley Mlombu. She's a human rights lawyer and currently employed by the South African Human Rights Commission as the provincial head for the Northwest Provincial Office of the Commission. She holds a bachelor's degree of law, a postgraduate diploma in public management, and a master's degree from the University of Witwatersrand and the University College of London, respectively. She's deeply committed to the utilization of the law as an emancipatory tool for the disadvantaged and marginalized. So we are very also proud to have Ms. Mlombu as one of the senior managers in the South African Human Rights Commission. And Shirley, if we perhaps can ask your initial thoughts on the topic that we will be discussing tonight.
Good evening to my fellow panelists. Good evening to yourself, Dr. Carter. And I think in my introductory remarks, I'd like to align myself to the submissions that have been made by the fellow panelists to say, indeed, over the last few decades, there's been a lot of focus on getting women to enter, previously male-dominated spaces, but there has been less focus on creating environments that are conducive to accepting new forms of leadership, and particularly forms of leadership that are decidedly female. And as a result, you don't have only an alienation of women from their fellow women, but you find that even the spaces that women find themselves in, as has been indicated, you find that they are also alienated. So while you may be perceived from the outside to have already entered these male-dominated spaces, but when you are inside, you realize quite quickly that even those spaces do not embrace you. So you find that women leaders often find themselves in no man's land, in spaces that don't embrace them as women. So and unfortunately, because of the culture that we all come from, you find that this resistance to women leadership is, you don't only experience it from our male counterparts, but is also experienced amongst female counterparts because of the culture that has not been dismantled, or because of the ideas about leadership that have not been challenged, in those spaces where we are required to lead. So I think this is a very important discussion to really unpack the gendered nature of these institutions, and how we can incrementally start pushing back against these gender norms, that undermine female leadership, that disempower female leadership, and diminish their contribution in those spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley, for that valuable contribution. It's clear that there's been a movement towards getting women onto these platforms and into these positions. But it is as if society was not yet ready to deal with when we get there. And how do we deal with these female leaders who might not emulate the masculinity reflected from our male counterparts in these positions? And how does society and our employees and the workers at large respond to that? And I think that's definitely something that's interesting to unpack as well. So thank you so much, Shirley, for that quick introduction. Now, I think the next portion of our discussion, I would like to us to venture into a more of a historical context of where did we come from in respect of where will we be going. And Commissioner Ntuli, we've heard from the panelists now that it's something that we can clearly agree on, that the system of patriarchy, misogyny has meant that for eons, women have not been allowed in what we call the C-suites, and that has now almost translated up until very recently as sometimes a very symbolic gesture to allow the woman into these C-suites and at the table. But what do we do then when the women are allowed? And I'm using allowed because it has been seen through a very misogynistic point of view to be almost a gift that is given to women to be able to speak at these tables. What do we then do when the women get to the table? So Commissioner Ntuli, if I can perhaps ask you to take us through a conversation in terms of historical influences on gender biases within institutions, where afterwards we will then as a panel reflect on what does this history look like and what should we be very much aware on, where are we coming from in order for us to know where we will be going. Commissioner Ntuli.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Carter. And good evening once again to my fellow panelists, the Deputy Chairperson of the Public Service Commission and the Provincial Manager in the Northwest Provincial Office. In responding to your question, Dr. Carter, I want to borrow from the seminal work of our sister Nirmal Powar. It's called Space Invaders, Race, Gender, and Bodies Out of Place. I think it's a good script through which we can use to discuss or to draw on the history of the gendered nature of institutions. This work provides the necessary foundation for exploring the gendered nature of institutions. It questioning what happens when those embodied differently come to occupy spaces where they had been previously excluded. Powar posits that the historical constructions of certain types of bodies as naturally disposed to occupy certain positions renders bodies entering spaces from which they had been previously excluded as perpetually othered, and is often met by resistance and denial of belonging. So it's this othering that is at the center of women's experiences in these institutions and positions that had been mainly initially established for male bodies. The marking of spaces and bodies as othered means that women who occupy positions previously reserved for men not only disrupt institutional norms, but they enter and participate in positions they had been previously excluded from with the perpetual marking of foreignness. The key challenge facing these newcomers is that they arrive to previously set templates for organizational cultures, organizational logics, speeches, gestures, ways of being, even dressing, into which they are pressured to assimilate. Powar also argues that in order to fully understand the dynamics involved when those embodied differently come to occupy spaces where they had been previously excluded, the gendered and racial symbolism of such positions has to be underscored. To say, therefore, that positions have gendered or racial symbolism means that the power relations and actions therein are patterned in terms of a distinction between male and female or white and black. Formal institutions and organizations in particular have historically been exclusive to men and have sustained a universal image of their ideal incumbents as occupying male bodies. As a result of this, traditional and critical approaches to their functioning originate in the male domain, and they take their behavior and perspectives to represent that of all humans. It follows, therefore, that the racial symbolism reflected in power relations will mean the presence of a hierarchy of acceptable actors and acceptable actions, with white men at the apex of this hierarchy. Similarly, the gendered nature of power relations suggests that race might differently systemize Black and white women's gendered experiences of institutions. And what I'm then bringing to the discussion is that even when we discuss the gendered nature of institutions and women's otherness or foreignness to institutions, the race influence into the discussion also renders the experiences of white women and Black women very different because of the racialized nature of the social hierarchy. And this is also quite important to note. Now, in conclusion, not only are institutional processes often theorized as gender neutral, so that these issues are not discussed, in ways that mask hierarchies of oppression, they are seen as separate from the people who occupy the positions within them. And what this results in is that behaviors within organizations that are often viewed as deviations of the gendered actors themselves, and not as components of the organizational or institutional cultures. So you isolate the actor, and you don't associate the actions of the actor with the culture and the logic of the institution itself. And this logic exacerbates women's vulnerabilities to marginalization and inequalities within institutions, because people often view inequality as vested outside of themselves, especially people in powerful positions. We often view inequalities and discrimination as actions of others and not actions that can be committed in executive or positions of authority, so that when they do occur, they are often seen as something beside the institutional role of the organization. And furthermore, the informal, everyday interactions and practices which reproduce the inequalities are not often documented due to the very subtle and often unspoken nature of gender discrimination. I'm going to pause here, Dr. Carter, to allow the discussion to further itself. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Ntuli. I think that really gives us the historical context and where we as a society are coming from, and that this is not a singular issue. It is an issue that is flowing from so many levels of intersectionalities and vulnerabilities at the end of the day. So perhaps, Deputy Chairperson, in respect of Commissioner Ntuli's assertion of othering, historical context in relation thereto, is this, from your view, also from the Public Service Commission's view, where you have had almost a bird's eye view of the relevance that women bring to these high-level positions? What has been your experience when we speak about othering, and perhaps the historical context in improving these environments for women alike to be able to not only feature at these levels, but also to participate meaningfully? Deputy Chairperson Kolomba, if I can ask you to perhaps engage on that point, and also if I can ask you to put on your camera, because if just a reminder to my colleagues that we are live streaming on YouTube, so our members of the public might want to see who's addressing them. Over to you, DC.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Carter. So then for me, when it comes to the question of othering, is the fact that it's only certain voices in the boardroom, in the workplace, in executive positions that are heard, amplified, and not ignored. Women's perspectives, their experiences, their contribution is ignored and is basically not seen as critical in shaping our agenda for social transformation. And when it comes to our historical perspective and our historical experience, I personally believe that the movement formed by the Lillian Goyas of this world, when they marched to Parliament as 20,000 women fighting for their right to be regarded as human and not just the weaker sex or the vulnerable sex of society, that's where our agenda and our movement for gender and women emancipation actually started. And that's where our backbone for our humanness as women in society actually not started necessarily, but that's when it found great impetus in society. So the issue of the othering of the woman body, the feminine body, the gendered body, is the fact that women's voices, their experiences, their contribution is not heard in the boardrooms of society, is not listened to in the workplaces of society. And that's because we are considered as secondary citizens in society and not as people who are critical towards the transformation of society. And this is where the othering of the female voice and her experiences becomes problematic, as Commissioner Ntuli has already outlined in her presentation. And this is what we need to challenge as society. Women's voices, their experiences, their contribution needs to be regarded as critical for the upliftment, transformation, and building of society, because we are the majority citizens in this country, and our experiences should matter the most. We are the ones who are dependent on government services, and our experiences and challenges need to be addressed and matter the most. So the othering of women in our society needs to be challenged. We are critical, we're important, we are treasured, we are valued, and our contribution towards social upliftment needs to be considered in very high regard, Dr. Carter. And this is my contribution towards today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Chairperson. Absolutely. I think you make it very clear that women cannot be regarded as second-class citizens, and that we are not adjacent to the discussions. We are not adjacent to movements in the country and political ideologies. We are centered, and we should be centered in these discussions and in these positions specifically. So Shirley, Ms. Mlombo, maybe I can ask you, when we look at the historical context, I always find it very interesting that women, and I think Commissioner Ntuli even mentioned something, and it reflected on even how women dress, how we are perceived in terms of what we wear. It has very much its roots vested in how closely we have been able to emulate men in our leadership abilities in our leadership positions. So to give you an example is I always look to the legal fraternity where we speak about power dressing. So my observation, and I know there's a lot of discourse on that as well, is that the closer that the woman emulates the image of the man, the more serious the woman would be taken. We speak about, the suits, the power dressing, but in fact, it is just to be related closely to the masculinity, because in that extent, we will be taken more seriously. And that surely comes from the historical context that we are uncomfortable with that which is foreign and that which is strange and that which is other. And until we can recognize that comfortableness or that something that we can relate to, we're going to be very hesitant to invite it closer. So with that context, Ms. Mlombo, looking at the historical, nature of gendered institutions, how would you describe the roots of this, and how does it look in respect of the history of this discussion?
I would say that many of the issues that we're dealing with, they are rooted in families, how we interact as families, and how we interact as communities, and of course, it just spills over to institutions. So if we are to disrupt the culture of othering of women, unfortunately, is not a discourse that can start at an institutional level. It has to start in the family, how males and females interact in families. It could be immediate families, it could be extended families who get to make critical decisions in families. It's mostly your male counterparts, and females in families don't have much say. So my proposal is that if we want to change, then we have to start at a family level. and then that will create a new culture that can feed into new institutional cultures. But also just to touch on the contribution you've just made about how as women we are expected to emulate leadership styles of men. And I will say there's also a contradiction in that. Whilst people would say or expressly that for your leadership to be accepted, it must emulate the leadership style of men. But in practice, when women actually emulate the leadership style of men, they are often labeled as bullies. They are often labeled as authoritarian. But when you analyze the behavior, is exactly the same behavior as their male counterparts. But when the same behavior is exhibited by a male counterpart, it is more accepted or acceptable in society. But when a female mimics the behavior of a male counterpart, it is labeled as very negative behavior. And one example of this, it's just a well-known example of a female leader, who's being taken to task, partly because of emulation of male leadership. This female leader was accused of making subordinates stand when she walks into a room. But if you look at that behavior, it's behavior I've experienced firsthand from a male minister, and no one ever complained. So I think there's just that contradiction. Yet when we want to present or engage as females, that form of leadership is still not accepted. So hence, when I get back to my initial point that women leaders are often isolated, they're in no man's land, because whatever style you adopt of leadership, there's always this question, it's always questioned. There's always something wrong with it. And essentially what is being said is that you are not welcome in the space. You are not supposed to occupy this space. So that's why it becomes difficult then for women to find a home in the spaces where they lead, because whatever strategy they seek to adopt, it is questioned by society. So I guess it feeds into the othering, where you are in a space that is not considered your space. So, but just in a nutshell, for us to disrupt or to challenge this is conversations that we have to start having in our homes. Dr. Carter?
Hi, Shirley. Thank you. I think Dr. Carter is probably experiencing a bit of a glitch. I'm trying to get a hold of her. So if you could just give her a few seconds, or I will take over from here. Thank you. think we can move over to the next presentation or section, and I'd like to hand over again to Commissioner Ntuli, who after we engaged on the conversation and the historical and analyzing contemporary, I'd like us to go to Commissioner Ntuli to discuss obstacles in achieving gender equality within institutions.
Thank you, Zugiswa, for taking over. Good evening to you. Perhaps in responding to your question, I want to complicate further the input made by the provincial manager in the Northwest with regards to the contribution of families. And I want to do so by introducing families themselves as institutions and as agents of socialization. By doing so, I agree with the provincial manager to say that families are key avenues for us to address this issue of socialization into men being better and women being othered, when it comes to especially institutions of professions. Families work together with other very critical institutions in socializing society, such that by the time we are grown and we enter institutions, we come to it with the teachings and the learnings from these institutions, which themselves are gendered. So the argument I'm making is that families are not only institutions themselves, but they themselves are gendered institutions. And they are a very good example of what we mean by institutions being gendered. Because you can have a home or a household that has, let's, for example, 5 women in that household. One mother and maybe her sister, and they are raising, say, 3 girls, and then there's one boy who's younger than all of them. Maybe he's the last born. In most cases, all of those 5 women will use the teachings that they have learned to empower and to socialize the boy into thinking and to noting that he is the man of the household and he has a particular power that is different to the other women in the household. And that positions him in a position of powerfulness, differently to his sisters, differently to his aunt, and differently to his mother. Similarly, and concurrently, they go to school, and this is the next agent of socialization, where the school system itself, not only the teachers who teach, but the literature that is being taught, further perpetuates the socialization of children into gendered beings, because the institution itself is defending patriarchy and sexism. Then on the weekend, they hang out with their friends. Friendship circles themselves are institutions that are gendered, because in those circles, we learn what the role, or we practice what we have learned of the role of boys and girls, men and women. Then, whether it be Saturday or Sunday or Friday, depending on our religious affiliation, we go to our institutions of religious belief. That is then the 4th institution, which is an agent of socialization, which further perpetuates the gendering of individuals. And then, of course, there is the media that we consume on a daily basis, which is also a gendered institution. So all of these institutions together work hand in hand in collaboration with each other to socialize society, and doing so reinforcing gendered norms, gendered cultures, and ideas about men being better than women and women being less powerful and holding positions that are less than men. So in addressing these issues, by the time we get to the boardroom, we have long been socialized and we come into an institution which itself is gendered. So I want to conclude by agreeing with the provincial manager in the Northwest that families are key institutions, but they don't act alone. They act together with the schooling system, the media system, the peer system as an institution itself, and religious institutions. And all of these are gendered institutions themselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Ntuli. Also, apologies, colleagues. I was disconnected there for 1 second. I think, Commissioner Ntuli and colleagues, we have been conditioned to almost not accept the female leadership that we so very desperately need. And I think that what we've mentioned earlier, as well as not only from a patriarchal point of view, from men almost disregarding, in a sense, the leadership attributes and abilities of women, but women themselves. Not necessarily creating that space or that we are conditioned not necessarily to create that space for women to take the lead. In a recent discussion I had with the Department of Community Safety, I think it was on Friday, where we literally mentioned that as how they call it, counterparts, we need to support each other. But we don't necessarily see those types of discussions relevant in the conversations men are having, that they need to support each other in leadership positions, support each other. And it's because we also see each other as foreign when we are not seen as the nurturers. And that is a concept that I'm not sure, Commissioner Ntuli, DC, Shirley, you also feel should be something that is addressed head on, because in my discussions with that specific group of women, they themselves said, women, we are nurturers, women, we are nurturers. And I felt that that was something very, very much ingrained in us, and that it's sometimes seen as a standalone, and that is all we are. And if we are not then those nurturers, and surely you made mention as well, the softer, more accepting leaders, then that becomes a foreign concept and a foreign example for those that we are supposed to lead. Because surely we must be those nurturing bodies that they unfortunately only exampled through their own familial structures. It was the mothers. The mothers, I mean, for 50 years ago, we were not allowed to study and take up leadership positions formally. So the examples that were out there were the nurturers. And now the expectation, unfortunately, is continuing. So with that in mind, and also having a look, I recently read about the Harvard Business Review, which said that there was this position that women were not ascending to the highest echelons in terms of leadership positions because they had to opt out to be the nurturers at home. And in fact, the recent research showed that that is not the case. The case is that people are merely not appointing women to those positions, and sometimes they're using it from the other side to say, no, but you took off to take care of the children, or you were the nurturer, so that's why you probably had to take time out. And in fact, that's not the case. So how do we deal with these societal hurdles that are still there, whether it's being perpetuated by family structures, the church, these institutions, or whether it's just women not being appointed to these positions because they are seen as the weaker leaders? How do we address this, and how do we move forward from this and take the leader or the leading position in this discourse as women? And perhaps DC Nkolomba, I can ask you, what would you propose as the solution to, I mean, we only have an hour, but we can unpack this for so many hours and days even. How would you propose us moving forward, looking at the public service, for instance, and how can we leverage the strengths that women bring to the table and pierce through these societal expectations and hurdles that we are experiencing?
So, Dr. Carter, I personally believe that both men and women can be nurturers in the household, in family life, and in the home life. It's not just the woman who's a nurturer. A man has innate ability to equally be a nurturer in the household. It's not just a competency or a characteristic that is subjected to women. Secondly, Dr. Carter, I believe that even if you are a nurturer in the household, as a mother, as a wife, it doesn't mean that you can't lead in society, lead in the workplace, lead in the boardroom. We can actually do both, and actually do both excellently and perfectly. I personally believe, Dr. Carter, that women need to be given the responsibilities to lead in society, because women leading in the household more generally, that extends itself naturally to a leadership position, a managerial position in the workplace, in society, in the world. So we're not limited as women to lead in the different spheres of society. And I think that women need to assert their human rights, their humanness, their right to occupy positions of authority, their right to occupy positions of power and positions of responsibility. We have a right to occupy the seat around the tables where we choose to lead and to occupy responsibility. And that's the only way that we can make sure that we get appointed in positions of authority in society, by asserting our voices, asserting our rights, and asserting our humanity.
Thank you, DC. That's very clear. And I absolutely agree with you that we can do more than one thing. We can be more than one thing. Commissioner Ntuli, how do we address this? And I know I've mentioned again, I wish we had, a whole day to just discuss and invite so many different voices to this table. But how do you propose we address this? Is assertiveness the answer? Is the starting at home the answer? Is it ourselves? Have we been conditioned to think that we must act a certain way, manage a certain way, or push ourselves a certain way for us to be absorbed into this very male-dominated environment, which is leadership positions and in institutions? How do we move forward from this to create momentum, if I can call it that, towards a greater representativity in institutions, towards gender equality?
Thanks, Dr. Carter. I agree with the Deputy Chairperson of the Public Service Commission that men and women can be nurturers, just as men and women can build rocket ships and houses. The roles that we have been conditioned to believe that we belong to are not really ours. They belong to a society that is interested in maintaining the power of one gender over another. How do we move past this? Through insisting. But firstly, before we even insist, we have to understand that this is a political struggle. And like all political struggles, I'm sorry about that. Like all political struggles, it requires political strategy, it requires political mobilization, and it also requires political movement. Without a movement, an organized movement of women who understand the struggle as political, the war will not be won, or the struggle will not be won. What we will have are burned out feminist activists within different pockets of society and institutions who fight alone and who die alone inside due to the strain of feeling that they are fighting a losing battle. So my view and contribution is that we have to raise our level of consciousness to understand the alienating effect of fighting a struggle that is not organized, to insist on organizing, and therefore to insist on fighting further. That is the only way that we are going to dismantle patriarchy, which is a system that is beyond individuals, and individuals alone cannot fight it. And lastly, I do agree with you. It has to be fought at all levels, at family level, at religious institution level, at school level, curriculum level, media level, and even amongst our friends and amongst our lovers. Those of us who are in heterosexual relations also have a big struggle ahead of them, because you have to re-socialize yourself and recondition your own partner as well, because heterosexual relations have a way in which they reinforce and reproduce gendered stereotypes, because there's a role for a man and there's a role for a woman, and it must be enforced. And we have to be able to be conscious enough to be willing to dismantle those roles that have been created for us by society. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Ms. Mlombo, I think maybe just a last tip from your side. I do know that as female managers, we sometimes feel alienated, and that is what you've mentioned. And I think Commissioner Ntuli has also mentioned that it puts strain on female leadership, because you feel like you are fighting a battle alone. What would your comments on addressing that be, in view of Commissioner Ntuli's call for action, that this need to be a collective effort, that surely we can't take this on our own? What's your feeling and your view in terms of your personal experience on that?
Okay. I think I fully agree with what the speakers have said. Nothing has ever been given to us as women. So everything that we have achieved so far, we had to take it by force. So I do agree that there needs to be that insistence that we are treated properly as leaders. And that, unfortunately for now, we can do that through collective struggle. Of course, while the idea of support may have those negative connotations of infertilizing women, but at this point of the struggle, as Commissioner said, we can only achieve this struggle if we work together, if we support each other as women across various leadership platforms. But beyond the struggle that needs to be fought at a family level, society level, institutional level, there is an internal battle that Commissioner has also alluded to, where leaders, female leaders, have to socialize themselves, because it just compounds the alienation if society is alienating you and you also see yourself as an intruder or an imposter. So I think there is a mental work or struggle that has to be fought. And this is a daily struggle at an individual level where we affirm ourselves as women that we are not imposters and we belong in those spaces. And therefore, we do not have to lead from a place of fear, but we can lead from a place of confidence. And lastly, for me, as part of the individual work that we also need to do as female leaders, our greatest weapon as well as female leaders, unfortunately, is competence. When you are a male leader and you assume a position, you are assumed to be competent before you do anything. But as a female leader, you have to show people that I am competent. And therefore, you should or can respect me. That's only then that people can start respecting the work that you do. So we unfortunately we're still at the place where we do have to work harder than our male counterparts and consistently be confident. I mean, be competent and show at individual level as well as a collective level that female leadership is as effective as male leadership in society as well as in institutions.
Thank you, Shirley. I think, again, throwing it also back to the individual, we need some introspection as well to make sure that we are not socialized in such a manner that we can't climb out of it. And at the end of the day, bringing our competence to the table. Because as you say, that's our greatest weapon. And when we bring that together collectively, I think Deputy Chairperson has already said it. We are the majority, small majority, but we should be the decision makers. We should be coming to the table en masse. And our voices should be the ones that are most amplified. And that is I can say fortunately, but also unfortunately, because that's our weapon through competence and competence alone sometimes. So it's a discussion surely that we would love to have for longer and more. Unfortunately, our time is up, and I'm going to, we've monitored the YouTube link. And although we've had the followers there, I think we don't have necessarily time to engage on the questions. Maybe I can ask a parting note in that respect from each one of the panel members, just to say in short, what is the greatest strength that women specifically can bring to this discourse, and which would enable us to collectively move forward? I know, Commissioner Ntuli, you said organize. Is that what we need to do? One step power shot as a voice, or perhaps as a note of departure. Is that what we need to do? Is this the way forward? Is this the way forward for us to mobilize and organize ourselves whilst we're doing those individual introspections? Commissioner Ntuli.
Thank you, Dr. Kata. Yes, I think for me, the parting shot is 1, consciousness, 2, sacrifice, 3, love, 4, struggle, and then, of course, 4, organizing and building movement. Those are the critical components for us to overcome sexism in our society. Thank you so much.
Deputy Chairperson, parting shot.
Dr. Carter, for me personally, I think our ability to dialogue and share in conversation, to be vulnerable, to assert our humanness is a weapon we can use powerfully in the fight against discrimination, sexism, misogyny, and patriarchy in general. Thank you very much.
Perfect, DC. Shirley, parting shot.
For me, areas of critical importance will be self-development amongst women leaders, as well as support. We need to support each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all the panel members and everyone who has joined online and on the YouTube channel following us live. As the facilitator, I think I can just wrap up to say that this has been very short, and I'm in need of more time to unpack and to further discuss this with the leaders around this table and the leaders that have come to show so much insight, whether it's from their positions themselves, but also whether it's from their studies and their personal experiences in the positions they are currently in. And I think there's a need for us to collectively almost move forward to have, like the DC is indicating, these types of dialogues and unpacking where are we seeing the most challenges as women leaders and female leaders in the, institutions, and where are we finding the most resistance. And I think there's been consensus that, yes, we need to insist on these spaces. We need to assert ourselves, but we also need to do introspection and see how have we been socialized. And then we need to go back to the home. And as Commissioner Ntuli has also said, we need to assess our relationships, whether we have determined our own roles in these relationships to be very patriarchal and very misogynistic in a sense, if we define them, and whether we have accepted that and we are proliferating that as females at the end of the day. So mine would be to thank everyone for the participation. What we will try and do is we will try and develop a short snippet with the highlights of this conversation, just to indicate what we talked about, and perhaps then share that through our social media pages as well. But we will invite all of you back to the conversations that will continue this month. Tomorrow, Zuki is hosting her conversation on GBV and developing technology. We will be hosting another conversation at the end of the month. But I think this is momentum that we need to carry through as women, having the voices around a table that are unique, that can be so many different things, that can be vulnerable and strong at the same time, and also then reflect what we learn in our respective areas and how we can strengthen each other to collectively tackle the sexist environment that we find ourselves in. That's me as a facilitator saying thank you very much. Commissioner Ntuli, as the host, if you can perhaps just say the final vote of thanks and a departing note, then we will wrap it up, and we thank everyone for their participation. Commissioner Ntuli.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. Sorry, my unmute button was acting up. I must thank you. I see my video is off again. I must thank you, Dr. Carter, the Provincial Manager in the Eastern Cape. I must also thank your team in the Eastern Cape Provincial Office for thinking about this very important topic and for hosting us on this very, very important day. I must also thank the Deputy Chairperson of the Public Service Commission for your time and for your very valuable contributions this evening. Mamum Olomba, thank you so much, Sisi. I must also thank the Provincial Manager in the Northwest Office, Ms. Shelley Mlombo. Thank you, Shelley, for your contributions. It was indeed a very valuable and insightful engagement that we've all had this evening. I must also thank everyone who has attended this event. I also see Martina and Laura Jane. Thank you so much for attending this event. I also see Nobesutu, who's also here. I also note that there are other members of our community and society who are joined with us on our YouTube platforms. Thank you to all of you. I wish you a good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And with that, Ms. Mlumbu and everyone else, we say good night. And until our next session tomorrow evening, you are welcome to join us as well. And we will see you next time. Goodbye.